There's one more topic under consumer behavior that we need to look at before we move on, and that is the concept of elasticity of demand. Now, elasticity of demand is defined as the responsiveness of a change in quantity demanded due to a change in price. Now, in a way, we've already looked at this way back when you first learned demand curves. You agreed that if price went up, quantity demanded would go down. And if price went down, quantity demanded would go up, right? That negative relationship that the law of demand tells us about. What we didn't talk about, either in the overview for this class or in macro, was the question, by how much? And that's what elasticity of demand or price elasticity of demand is all about. If you were, if you see, look at what happens when the price of gasoline changes. If it goes up, your demand drops. But by how much? In comparison to the price change, how much does quantity demanded change by? That's what we need to look at. Now, when we look at elasticity of demand, we say that there are four factors that influence the degree of elasticity of demand that we have. That's the type of good. Is it a luxury or a necessity? Are there substitutes available for the good? The percentage of your income you spend on the good, and the amount of time you have to adjust to the price change. All right. Now, we'll go over those in a moment. But when we look at elasticity of demand, it's on a spectrum, so to speak, from one extreme to another. One of those extremes is called perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand is if you change a price, demand changes infinitely. I tend to think of this as an overreaction. You overreact to the price change. For example, if you're purchasing a luxury item, something that you would like to have if you could, but it's not a necessity to have. You can live without it. If the price of a luxury item goes up, you're going to stop buying it. You don't need it to survive. You're going to stop. So even if there's a very small change in price, you have a very large reaction. Availability of substitutes. If there are lots of substitutes for the good, even a small change in price will cause you to go try to find one of those other substitutes. Why should I pay more? If you spend a large percentage of your income on a good, for example, your rent or your mortgage, if they make up a large percentage of your total monthly bills, if your rent goes up, even by a small amount, you may not be able to afford that apartment anymore. So you're going to have to change your demand for that apartment drastically. The amount of time you have to adjust. If you've got lots of time, if I tell you now that in a year the price of a good is going to go up, you're going to have lots of time to find an alternative. So your demand will change dramatically. Now, the important thing, and this is going to come back when we start looking at market structures, the important thing about elastic demand is that it gives us a horizontal demand curve. If the price goes up even slightly, you're off the demand curve. If the price goes down even slightly, you're off the demand curve. So while it's a little hard to see, perfectly elastic demand gives us that horizontal demand curve. And this is going to come back to us when we start looking at perfect competition. Now, the other extreme for our elasticity of demand is perfectly inelastic demand. Inelastic demand occurs that if price changes, quantity demand does not change at all. Now, a necessity item would be something like that. I usually think of medication. If you need one pill a day to survive, no matter what the price of that pill is, you are still buying that pill. If there are no substitutes for the good, the price can go up and you can't do anything about it. You can't buy something else. If you pay a small percentage of your income to that good, a change in price may not change your demand. I'll tell you what a bad mother I am. When my children were very small, I bribed them to be good when we went to the grocery store. I would buy them a cookie. There were these little cookie bars, chocolate chip cookie bars that they each liked. And I told them if they were good in the grocery store, when we were done, I would buy them a cookie. Now, when we started buying these, they were like 25 cents a bar. I have 2 kids. That was 50 cents out of my weekly budget. Not a big deal. But after a while, the price went up to 30 cents. All right. 25 cents, 50 cents. Well, it's actually 2 kids, 2 bars, 50 cents. Changed to 60 cents. Not a big change. Doesn't make up a big percentage of my income. I didn't change the amount of cookie bars I bought, which was a good thing because it kept my kids being nice in the grocery store for everyone's sake. It worked out well. If you have no time to adjust, your demand is not going to change. For example, if you drove onto campus today and you found a toll booth at the entrance to campus telling you had to pay immediately to park, well, if you're late for class, you have an exam, you've got to get going, you've got to get onto campus, you're going to have to pay that. Your demand for parking isn't going to change. Right? So what we find is that the demand curve for perfectly inelastic demand is going to be horizontal. No matter what the price is, you're demanding the same. And I'm sorry, did I say horizontal? I meant vertical. The demand curve is going to be vertical. Now, our goods, are they either perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic? No. Remember, in most cases, the demand curve is downward sloping. If we have a very steep demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, that good is considered relatively inelastic. Although it's downward sloping, it's steep like this inelastic demand curve. Right. If we have a fairly shallow downward slope, that is relatively elastic. It looks more like almost closer to the horizontal demand curve we saw on the last slide. Right. So you've been doing elasticity of demand ever since you started drawing demand curves. You didn't know it, but you were. Now, there's different types of elasticity. If an economist talks about elasticity of demand, they're probably talking about price elasticity of demand. We don't call it that, we just say elasticity. But there are a couple other types of elasticity of demand that we need to look at. One is something called cross-price elasticity of demand. That's the responsiveness of a change in quantity demanded of one good when the price of another good changes. All right. So if the price of milk changes, how is your demand for Oreos going to change? If you buy them together, the change in price of one is going to affect the demand for the other. We also talk about income elasticity of demand. If your income changes, how much will demand change by? There are corresponding price elasticities of supply and cross elasticities of supply. So these things work on both sides. Knowing the elasticity of demand is incredibly important for both governments and businesses to know. Because if price changes, a business is going to want to know whether they can pass that increase on to the consumer. If the demand for the good is highly elastic, the business can't pass that increase on to the consumer because they know they're going to lose a lot of demand. On the other hand, if their demand is highly inelastic, the business knows that if prices go up, they're not going to lose customers, so why not pass the price increase on to the consumer? Governments, on the other hand, need to know what the elasticity of demand is, because if they're going to raise taxes on a good to get a business to do something, for example, we'll see this later in the semester, when the government tries to tax businesses in order to get them to stop polluting, well, it didn't necessarily work. Because if the business now has to pay higher taxes, that increases the cost of production. If the business can pass that increase off to the consumer, the business isn't losing any money. It's not hurting their bottom line. They're just passing that tax on to the consumer. And so the business doesn't stop polluting, it just charges more, passes the increased money over to the government. So knowing what the elasticity of demand is very important for businesses. It's very important for governments. Businesses need to know if prices increase, what's going to happen to their revenue. Businesses need to know whether they can tax a business in order to get them to do something. All right. Let's now move on to look at business behavior.